Hello, and welcome to the 19th video in my Punishing Graven lore series. Today we'll be diving into the 5th released extra story chapter, Echo Aria. Previously in chapter 13, Graven journeyed into the depths of the Ascendant's base, where Lucia faced the past she shared with Alpha, overcoming the regrets holding her back. Grey Raven, along with Luna's help, defeated the Polyphage, Gabriel's magnum opus and the source of the Red Tide, ultimately losing both Washu's key and Luna's whereabouts after the implosion of her faction. Now we leave both the city and Collapse Cavern behind to deal with the aftermath of our fight and see what has become of the Tide after destroying its source. Now without any further delay, Extra Story Chapter 4, Echo Aria. Commandant sits in a transport heading back to Earth when the quiet hum of the engine drags him into his memories. There he listens to Asimov as he explains that due to Alpha's tampering, his mind beacon was corrupted, and to this point he still hasn't fully recovered. A side effect of this corruption is a tendency to slip into what Asimov calls memory replays. Translation: I hope you like flashbacks, because they are about to become very common. While nothing else is currently wrong with him, the Science Council are putting him on observation to see if any other issues arise down the line. His vision fragments again, and this time he sees Nicola chewing him out, explaining that what he did in the cavern warrants a court-martial. The only thing currently saving him from discipline is that he defeated the Polyphage, and punishing the hero who effectively saved the world from a potential catastrophe would send the population into an uproar. So they've decided to let him continue field operations, but he remains under constant observation, and if there's any slip-up on his part, not even Hassan would be able to save him from the consequences. His vision shifts to Hassan, who tells him that this issue is still far from over, but at least after the next mission his observation status will be lifted. Suddenly, the light from the sun snaps him back, and the worried voices of Grey Raven keep his thoughts from drifting again. Before they can speak further, an even harsher voice contacts them over the comms. This is Hans, acting chief commander of this current operation. Hans relays the details of the mission, and as soon as he speaks, Commandant's mind wanders once again.
Flashback.
24 hours ago, Commandant sits in a briefing room as Celica loads an image of a map covered in large swaths of red. Asimov steps forward, informing those who are not involved with the mission in City 75 about the nature of the Red Tide and the emergence of hetero creatures. After the battle, they assume the Tide was destroyed, but a portion of it slipped out through underground waterways and into ravines left by dried-out rivers. Fortunately, due to the Polyphage's destruction, it has been heavily diluted and is nowhere near as proactive as it once was. However, the new tributaries of Tide are slowly making their way to the ocean, and if they arrive, will allow the Tide to spread through and assimilate the entire ocean. In order to keep this from happening, we will be placing bit domain nodes, allowing us to map out the Tide's exact coordinates so Babylonia can initiate a saturation strike with the Longinus arsenal. Hassan stresses the importance of coordination and sound judgment, so he names Hans as chief commander of the mission. The flashback ends as Hans finishes his briefing, and the call terminates. We look out of the porthole, staring at the changing landscape below, as the transport begins its docking sequence. On the surface, Wanshi sits on a rock observing the Red Tide. Despite being so close, it's only an issue during high tide, the peak of the cyclic period when the virus concentration rises, but what actually worries him is the rate of the Red Tide's expansion. He puts away his rangefinder and stands, alerted by the roar of engines and a stream of smoke falling from the sky. Back on the transport, it makes its way through Earth's atmosphere, and the turbulence sends Commandant into another round of memory replays. He remembers a conversation with Ayla from before the mission, where she asks if we came into contact with the Ascendant who attacked her on the space station, that being Gabriel. She asks if we found any hint of Selena, but the memory ends before Commandant can hear her name properly. His mind returns to reality where the turbulence continues to escalate, and the wing of the transport is torn off. The system announces the need for an emergency evacuation and opens the tailgate for parachute procedures. Due to Commandant being unable to act during memory replays, he can't even undo his own seatbelt, much less grab a parachute. So as the other teams jump out, Lucia shields Commandant from the impact of the crash. After Commandant comes to, Lee cuts a hole in the hull of the transport to reveal we crashed amidst the Red Tide tributary, and having made all of the noise, we are attacked by the surrounding hetero creatures. Soon we are contacted by Wanshi, who helps us fight off the hetero creatures and leads us to a signal beacon, when a strange noise sounds out around us and the tide begins to rise. We make our way to Wanshi's position, and he explains that Strikehawk has been investigating the tide and searching for Hwashu since their supposed disappearance in City 75. In fact, Wanshi was the first to warn Babylonia of the red tide's current activity. We ask him about the rising tide, and he explains that the strange noise that we dub the whale song is connected to the tide somehow, as it can always be heard shortly before the tide rises. Wanshi leads us through the desert, and as the tributary gets further away, the whale song takes a much more somber tone, causing Kamanit's mind to wander, sucking him into his memories. Wanshi stops the group, having spotted a child in the distance. We head over to investigate and climb the hill to find a small settlement, along with Hans and the other Construct teams. In the center of the settlement, the refugees and the Constructs stand opposed to each other, until we arrive and Wanshi convinces Hans to ease the tension. Having seen the soldiers put away their weapons, the local elder steps out to talk with us. We explain the impending use of the Longinus arsenal and warn them to leave, but after speaking with the rest of the settlers, the old man simply tells us to keep down the noise before he and everyone else returns to their homes, fully aware of the impending danger. The situation now being resolved, Hans orders the deployment of the bit domain nodes, and having severely damaged ours in the crash, we are sent to wait on the sidelines. Back on Babylonia, Hassan and Nicola discuss why Hans was chosen as the chief commander for this operation. If the mission was truly as simple as Hassan explained it to be, Commandant would have more than sufficed, as he has by far the most experience around the red tide. But Hassan based his choice on the ability to handle unexpected situations, likely referring to the residents. In addition, it will be a chance for Commandant to see the types of hard-hearted decisions that may be required of him in the future, and to see if his current condition will impede his duties as Grey Raven's commandant. As day turns to night, Commandant's anxiety takes hold, and he gets up to look at the coastline. Wanshi appears behind him, along with Liv, who begins to change his bandages. While doing so, Commandant sees the young boy from earlier, calling him over. Commandant gives the boy some of his rations, and when Lucia brings him more food, the boy's grandmother comes and takes him away, clearly not a fan of Babylonia. As she leaves, the old man from before appears, bringing Commandant food. He hands over the food, and the rest of the team once again question his decision to stay. He explains that at the end of Operation Arcadia, when those who could left for Babylonia, those who remained were not just unfortunate souls who didn't get lucky. There were many who refused to leave, not wanting to abandon the planet they all called home. Those who were left behind were resolute in staying and made the most of their situation. They took pride in their simple lives, living day to day just trying to survive, enjoying the few simple pleasures life afforded them. The old man knows that even without Babylonia's involvement, they wouldn't have lasted much longer, and they were all aware of this. But even so, if they are to pass, their only wish is that they allow them to do so on their own terms, in the land they choose. When asked why he bothers to tell us all of this, the old man says it's because he sees weakness in Commandant's eyes, and knows that if he didn't say all of this, Commandant would end up taking the results of the mission personally. The man gets up and leaves, and we brood over the conversation, trying to wrap our heads around his words, when Hans approaches, having gotten new orders from Babylonia. He tells us that per regulation, civilians within an active mission area must be evacuated, regardless of force. Commandant closes his eyes, and in his memories finally answers Ayla's question, spitting out line after line of official information. Unsurprised by his serious answer, Ayla says Selena was different, and that even though she had never been to Earth, she had all these fantastical preconceptions. Although with all of these thoughts about Earth, not once did any of them ever consider the people who were left behind on the surface, and what they would think of Babylonia's return. Commandant opens his eyes and tells Hans that forcefully evacuating the residents is wrong. Hans reminds him that disobeying orders would result in a court-martial, and an even heavier sentence since he is still on probation from his earlier actions. Lee steps in front and acknowledges the order, with Hans finally turning to leave. As reluctant as we are to do it, we try to convince the residents to evacuate, eventually going to speak with the old man who leads them. He reminds us that his answer should go without saying, and Lucia continues questioning his choice. He tries using Babylonia as an example, saying that it was built as a colonization ship, yet it still continues trying to save a useless ruined Earth. Why? Because it's home. and you don't need any more reason than that. Lee pulls Lucia back, and just before we leave, a commotion breaks out. Hans and the old woman from before are arguing, when the whale song begins to sound in the distance. Everyone scrambles to prepare for combat, as hetero creatures break into the town. We fight them off, and as the whale song comes to an end, the hetero creatures retreat. If the hetero creatures have made it this far, it's not too crazy to assume the tide has also made its way here. The tension of the hetero creature attack puts everyone on edge, until the old woman from before begins screaming for her grandson Ray, the same boy we met earlier. Wanshi says he saw the boy run out west when the fighting broke out. We offer to get him back when Hans cuts us off, telling us not to waste time on trivial matters, and that we would be more useful guarding against hetero creature attacks. He tears into us for a solid minute, then the old man tears into Hans. Commandant leaves for some fresh air and finds Wanshi, who had used a secret FOS hand sign to call him here. Wanshi voices his concerns that the wide-scale attack might not be the best option. Suddenly he gets quiet, and the woman from before steps out from behind a corner, begging for our help in finding Ray.
You could not live with your own failure. Where did that bring you? Back to me.
She says that he likely ran off to find his father, who had long since died, but she never had the heart to tell him. Commandant accepts, and plans to leave with Wanshi, who isn't under Hans's command, even knowing that unauthorized leave would be counted as fleeing the battlefield. Wanshi gestures and Lee comes out from behind the tent, and having heard Commandant accept of his own will, he has no way to refuse. Lee says he will get Lucia and Liv, but Commandant wants them here to maintain peace and protect the settlement from any more attacks. Lee hates the idea, but relents and hands him a communicator, along with the repaired bit domain node, telling him Grey Raven won't evacuate unless he returns. Commandant and Wanshi make their way into the wilderness, and having neared where Ray should be, they take a break. Wanshi asks Commandant about his memory replay syndrome, but soon drops the topic to get to what he really cares about. Wanshi could have easily found the child on his own, but he wanted to ask about the source of the red tide and the evolution of the virus. This triggers another flashback, where Asimov tells Commandant that the events of the cavern, and that the tide is caused by the heterocore fragments, must remain top secret. Commandant doesn't tell Wanshi any of this, but as a scout, he is more than capable of piecing the information together himself. He says that since the tide originally had a source, the same must be true this time, and if so, following the tributaries all the way back would lead them right to it. This is why Lee gave Commandant the bit domain node. Commandant asks why Wanshi is going so far out of his way to get involved, and he says that it's to repay a debt to a man who once showed him some kindness. Having spent too much time talking, they get back to searching for Ray. They look around, following his footprints, but find that his trail doubles back heading towards the settlement. Somehow he navigated his way through the wilderness while avoiding the red tide. But even if the boy is gone back, the two agree to keep going forward and find the source. We contact Lee and let him know what we are doing so he can pass the message to Lucia and Liv. Then we cross the known area, heading further into the wild. Back with Grey Raven, Lee fills the others in on Commandant's plan to find the source of the tide, and while initially skeptical of his choice to leave them behind, Lee convinces them it's for the benefit of the mission and the safety of the settlers. Lee goes to speak with Hans, informing him of Commandant's absence and asking for a change in the strike plan. Lucia and Liv arrive with the refugees following behind them, begging Hans to reconsider. Just then, Ray returns to the camp and into his grandmother's arms. He tells her how he met what remained of his father within the tide, and she breaks down, with the sounds of their suffering weighing heavily on all those present. Hans thinks back on what Hassan told him during an earlier communication. After he reported in about the locals and their refusal to evacuate, Hassan decided to leave the situation to Hans's personal judgment, and explains the reason he asked him to lead was because Hassan does not want to pass the consequences of their decisions onto the next generation. The lives of those stuck on the surface are due to those who were around during Operation Arcadia, so the responsibility of having to judge the value of those lives once again should fall on those very same people. Hans snaps out of his daze to a soldier telling him that the nodes have all been deployed. He says to hold off, waiting for a second confirmation from the deployment teams, and whether or not this was intentional, gives Commandant much needed time. Back with Commandant, he and Wanshi continue walking. long after passing the effective range of Lee's improvised comms device. The song begins once more, and Commandant's mind sinks back into his conversation with Ayla as she continues on about her friend and her interest in the ocean. His zoned-out state is ended quickly as Wanshi snaps him back to reality. The two continue upstream, following the sound for quite some time as the smaller streams of the tributary merge together, and Wanshi's lazy demeanor becomes deadly serious. As they get closer, the sound gets louder, and they arrive at a lake of red tide where all streams merge together, and in front of them, a large humanoid figure, crucified in the center of the lake. Our presence seems to have roused the creature. It attacks, and Wanshi manages to defeat it, but its supposed death throes are extremely unusual. Not that it matters, as the creature gets back up, even more ferocious than before. Caught off guard, Wanshi is grabbed by Siren, and he fires his last bullet at its chest, cracking the plate open. Wanshi stares in shock, recognizing the construct acting as Siren's core as Selena. Wanshi's last attack left the monster temporarily inactive on the shore, as the virus begins repairing its body. Commandant activates the domain node, and sensing the danger, Siren attacks. Adrenaline floods his veins, and the faces of those he's encountered rush into his mind. Wanshi takes the hit for Commandant, and the exposed chest cavity is close enough for him to see Selena's face clearly. Finally remembering who she is, he whispers her name, and the creature pauses. Commandant approaches Selena, and with her last bit of self-awareness, she extends her hand and accepts the node. After planting the node, both Commandant and Wanshi make a break for it, trying to get as far away from the impending blast zone as possible. Wanshi contacts Lee, sending him data on Siren, and tells him to convince Hans to request a precision strike on Commandant's node to eliminate the tide at its source. Lee has Liv create a simulation using the data, presenting it to Hans, and after some thought, he contacts Babylonia, having accepted the new plan. Hassan, Nicola, and Asimov go over the data, and conclude that given the new circumstances, a precision strike would be the most viable option, but if it proves ineffective, Hassan will issue a second wide-scale orbital strike, risking both Babylonia and the ground teams. Deep within Selena's mind, she expresses her desire to visit the surface, despite never having been to Earth, only hearing about it as long-lost stories from her parents. This thought goes on, lasting for an eternity, or for only a moment. Time slips away as the pain eats away at her. That is, until she heard that name, Selena. And with every ounce of strength remaining, she opens her eyes, accepting the black needle and plunging it into her core. She looks up, catching a glimpse of the sky as a brilliant flash frees her from her suffering, and everything fades to nothing. Her remains sit quietly on the scorched earth as vestiges of the scattered tide crawl towards her, trying to rebuild the monster she once was. A female figure steps onto the tide. She walks over to the girl, extending her hand, causing the entire body to tremble violently. The hetero creature surrounding her melts back into tide, revealing a newly constructed body. The mysterious woman takes the heterocore fragment and leaves, all without saying a word. Run. Keep running. Don't look back. Wanshi and Commandant sprint away as a pillar of light falls from the sky. As long as you move forward, the guilt of the past won't catch up to you. The hetero creature and the figure within leave them both behind. On their way back, the desert is quiet and lifeless, the tide stagnant. and in the distance, 3 familiar figures standing on a hill. The 3 welcome Commandant back, and the pain on their faces reminds him that while he is more than willing to put his life on the line, the others aren't nearly as ready to let him die. They tell him that while some of the refugees will be taken to a conservation area, most have elected to stay where they are. Liv reminds him that he stood up for their beliefs, and even if they didn't change their minds, in the end, it was the right call to make. While the soldiers pack their equipment, Hans stands on a hill outside the camp looking at the coast in the distance. The old man joins him, and there Hans reflects on his choice to leave Earth all those years ago. Had there been another way, Hans would have stayed, but as a soldier, it was his duty to live, to carry out his mission, to seek revenge, to hold on to hope. There he admits to himself that he is not the unyielding monolith others see him as. He's just an old soldier carrying on the memory of a lost age. The girl waits, trapped in darkness, until she was freed by that kind voice in the light from the sky. And with the rising sun, she regains her senses, but having lost her memory, her purpose, her very name. Even so, the girl gets up and takes her first steps to explore her new world. Kamui disturbs Wanshi in his recovery room and brings up a swollen metal can, and just the sight of it brings back memories of his distant past. Wanshi and another construct named Troy search a city and clear out any lingering corrupted. Troy starts a conversation to kill the silence, and asks why an elite squad member like Wanshi would bother taking a mission on the front lines with a nameless grunt like himself. And Wanshi, our oblivious king, has no idea how impressive the other constructs see both him and the Strikehawk members. Troy climbs atop a crumbling wall, and below him sees the remains of countless corrupted and constructs, remnants of a costly battle. He voices his concerns to Wanshi, wondering if all the deaths are worth it, if the millions of sacrifices are worth the temporary victories. While Wanshi has no answer to these questions, he knows that to take back Earth, they need to eradicate the virus in its entirety, and he knows that goal will likely cost them far more in the future. Hearing this answer, Troy falls silent, and the two get back to their objective. After Troy confirms the lack of life signs ahead, Wanshi sets himself up on a nearby vantage point, and Troy steps into the ruins to collect the file. He steps into the ruins and runs into a solid black figure. Wanshi panics, yelling at Troy to escape as rubble and steel are thrown out of the ruins along with Troy himself. Out of the dust cloud, a dark figure appears. Wanshi and Troy try a scan and find their equipment is useless in identifying the figure. Troy says the figure, which identifies itself as Gear, has taken the file they were sent to retrieve. Wanshi rappels down, emptying his clip, and after a brief fight, manages to knock Gear down, assuming the fight is over. He runs over to heal Troy, only to have Gear stand back up, and I am not exaggerating. He beats Wanshi within an inch of his life. The abuse continues for some time, but gradually slows down. Gear looks down at his arm to find it covered in a layer of frost. Wanshi lands a powerful kick, and combined with the numbing of the frost, causes Gear to let go. Wanshi fires a shot at Gear but misses, only to reveal it wasn't a bullet he shot, but a wire. Troy, who is now hovering in midair, catches the other end, and together they wrap Gear in the wire, stringing him up midair. The two flee knowing the trap won't last forever, and try sending the combat data to Babylonia, only to learn something is jamming the signal. They plan to split up and rendezvous later, switching to stealth mode to avoid detection. As the two run off in opposite directions, Gear destroys the rope and frees himself, saying he must eliminate all potential threats and make preparations for the arrival of the Sage. Wanshi runs through the city as the pain from his earlier injuries takes its toll. His limbs begin to tremble and his eyesight grows dim. He collapses to the ground, and right before he blacks out, a figure walks towards him, as darkness takes over and he loses consciousness. In some other location, Kamui is being picked up by a retrieval squad. He brings up their late arrival, and they tell him that non-corrupted interceptor drones were the cause of the delay. He boards the transport and has the ship return to Babylonia instead of their next objective. And as the ship takes off, he connects to Strikehawk's private channel, speaking to Chrome about Wanshi's disappearance due to him entering stealth mode. On Babylonia, Chrome enters the bridge to speak with Hassan and Nicola about Wanshi's situation and requests to lead a rescue mission. Nicola argues back, claiming that Chrome's bias will have him prioritize rescuing Wanshi rather than securing the needed file. And having no other choice, Chrome bets on his name of Langston Smith, willing to risk his father's reputation to prove that he will deliver on his word. Back on the ground, Wanshi wakes up in an underground bunker. He tries to get up and is greeted by the muzzle of a rifle pointed at his head. The man who saved him, named Arnold, asks what Wanshi even is, clearly having little to no experience with constructs. They run through introductions, and soon afterwards Arnold leaves, giving Wanshi enough time to try and run a diagnostics check. The check returns that he's extremely damaged, and having reinforced the obvious, he takes a nap. When Arnold returns, he says the amount of corrupted outside has increased dramatically, and with it, the danger. Wanshi tells Arnold to leave him behind, but the old doctor refuses, having seen the lack of compassion that was all too common in the Golden Age. So if it's too dangerous to stay, Arnold will make sure Wanshi also has the strength to stay alive, and decides to start with fixing his motor functions. Arnold gets to work, and with Wanshi's guidance, manages to navigate his way around the unfamiliar tech. Arnold talks about his experiences at the start of the outbreak and how caught off guard he was. He lives far outside the city, so news didn't reach him until he had left his bunker to discover the world had already changed for the worse. Wanshi asks to see Arnold's helper bot, and uses it to display projections of Babylonia, giving Arnold a glimpse of where people are living now. Wanshi shows him scenes of constructs dying in battle against the corrupted, and Arnold can't help but ask, why are you trying to retake Earth? Wanshi still doesn't know the answer to that question himself, but believes that stopping here would be a betrayal of all those who went and died, all striving to reach that same dream called Earth. Chrome and Kamui drop into the mission area, having run into the same interceptor drones from before. They step out, only to be attacked as a projectile flies between the two, only to discover it's Troy's severed head. Kamui charges in the direction of the attacker and levels a building, only to be struck from behind by Gear. Kamui is saved by Chrome, and having seen from their dog tags that they are also a part of Strikehawk, he assumes that killing them here might lure Wanshi out of hiding. Back in the bunker, Arnold nearly finishes repairing Wanshi when BuddyBot projects a map of the city for the both of them to see. 3 signals are seen running around clashing, and Wanshi confirms it's the rest of Strikehawk. Only one step remains, and Arnold places BuddyBot into Wanshi's hand, as a series of connectors extend, linking the two. Energy pours into him, and before he can protest, Arnold tells him it will serve as his thanks for showing him the outside world. And with that, the two leave the bunker. Stepping into the moonlight, they see a building collapse in the distance, and Arnold sends Wanshi off. Back in the fight, Gear is thoroughly suppressing the two with an onslaught of close-range attacks and machine gun fire. Gear continues applying pressure, saying how they should gladly die and make way for the Sage. They manage to slip behind some cover, only to have it blown apart. And as Gear prepares to deliver the final blow, a silver orb of light stops the attack. Gear is forced back, and the 2 constructs in front of him vanish to the top of a nearby building. Now reunited with Wanshi, the 3 prepare to eliminate their enemy with the full might of Strikehawk. In the distance, Arnold watches a projection of the battle, and the flashes of combat bring him back to the days of Operation Arcadia, when he first refused to go to Babylonia, instead choosing to live the life of an outcast. He admits that he once lived to prove the old era of humanity wrong, to live away from the problems of society, but that era is long gone, and now he is no more than a man too stubborn to die. But if the future is left in the hands of the constructs, perhaps the cycle of mistakes that plagued the old world could be broken, and Earth could be guided down a new path. Gear continues to fight back against the 3, but their relentless attacks and peerless synergy force him back bit by bit, as any weakness possessed by one member is covered by another. Gear is met by a 3-pronged attack that sends him flying into another building. He gets up to see they are back where Wanshi first made his retreat, but this time is different. This time Wanshi has his comrades with him. The 3 work as a single entity, blocking Gear's attacks and stripping his defenses. 1, 2, 3. He calculates trajectory, adjusts the angle, and fires. A silver orb of light passes through Chrome's slash, and now imbued with electricity, it slams into Gear's head where he had been wounded by Kamui's slash. Having underestimated the trio, Gear speaks his last words before collapsing to the ground. Shrouded by a faint light, Wanshi walks towards Gear's remains and takes back the file, returning to where he left Arnold, only to find the little robot in a can of herring. He touches the bot and a projection of Arnold appears. He bids his farewell to the human of the new age, finding that Wanshi has more humanity than anyone during the so-called Golden Age. As a human from a lost era, he leaves, intending to fade away into history, just like the past he came from. He leaves to make way for the new world, for a new era of constructs. He tells Wanshi to take the can of herring and let it serve as a token from the old man drifting in a lost world. Chrome and Kamui catch up, and having laid the robot back down, he grabs the can and they finally leave. As the transport ship disappears into the night, the city is quiet once more, and two figures emerge from the city ruins. They express shock that the chariot was defeated, but overall, their mission was successful, as the file was backed up and sent to their organization. They clean up the body, and using the strange light from earlier, they erase knowledge of Chariot from Shrikehawk, not wanting to expose their existence to Babylonia just yet. Long ago, Grey Raven embarked on their first large-scale operation, having proved themselves on numerous solo missions. Hassena's decided now is a good opportunity to demonstrate how coordination between constructs and commandants will increase success on the battlefield. Lucia and Liv finished transferring to their secondary frames. For Lucia, Dawn, and for Liv, an older frame, one she stopped using after joining Grey Raven, Lux. The transport begins its descent, and we prepare ourselves for the task ahead. After landing, Lee decides to investigate the area outside the camp, while everyone else goes to speak with the commander for this mission. We enter the tent to find a woman tapping away on holoscreens. We introduce ourselves, and find the commander of this mission is Vanessa, leader of Egret, Liv's former team. She starts taking jabs at Liv's decision to use her old frame, and over the course of the conversation, we learn Vanessa's views on constructs, finding that she sees them as nothing more than toys for her amusement. The tone of the conversation becomes increasingly aggressive until Lucia gets our focus back on the mission, reminding Vanessa that if anything goes wrong, she will shoulder the blame as commander. Reluctantly, she withdraws her hostility and gives us our mission, and now having our orders, we leave, not wanting to draw any more attention. We fight our way through the city streets and Lee speeds ahead of the group, eliminating every corrupted he finds. Lucia checks in to warn him of his distance from everyone else, saying that if he runs into danger, we won't be able to provide backup in time. He ignores her warning and continues to advance further, when his voice suddenly cuts out, replaced by the crackle of static. Liv also loses Lee's signal, and we speed ahead to his last known location, only to find him at the bottom of a pit, having fallen into an EMP trap.
And I can't get up!
Corrupted begins swarming our position, and Lee tells us to leave him behind. Liv also confirms that leaving him behind would minimize potential losses, and that type of logical ruthlessness is the secret behind Egret's repeated victories. However, we aren't Egret, and Commandant uses his knife as an anchor, jumping into the hole. He ties Lee to his back and begins climbing up the rope, as Lucia and Liv defend them from the corrupted. The two finally make it out the hole, greeted by mechanical remains and two very fatigued constructs. We look for a safe place to rest and settle on a nearby rooftop. Lee sets up a perimeter, and Lucia apologizes to Commandant for her earlier hesitation, chastising herself for not being a better captain. Commandant reassures her that she is doing just fine, and to focus on her strength rather than her mistakes. Liv finishes her scan, and we devise a new battle plan. Lucia and Lee will take the streets leading up to the main factory, and Liv will stay behind with Commandant to provide long-range support. Lee jumps off the roof and heads back into battle, with Lucia following soon after. Liv laments on how unreliable she is compared to the others, and Commandant continues to play team therapist, telling her to simply be herself, as that's all anyone can ask of her. Lee and Lucia secure the streets as Liv watches over them from the rooftops, and together they clear the area of corrupted, making their way back to Commandant's position. They comment on how despite Vanessa giving them one of the harder missions, it's going quite well.
You're a jinx! Do you hear me?
When not a moment too soon, jitter bombs detonate at the base of the building, toppling it over. Commandant grabs the rappelling gear to slow his fall, but the rapid descent causes the rope to burn through his gloves and tear into his hands. Lee and Lucia rush to try and stop the fall, but Lucia's frame finally hits its limit and overheats, causing her legs to malfunction. Unable to move, she takes a gamble and throws her katana, embedding the rope into the wall and stopping Commandant just shy of the ground. Afterwards, Liv helps him down, and Lee helps the still limping Lucia meet us at the base of the building. After a series of apologies over events no one could have possibly controlled, Liv dresses Commandant's bloodied hands, and Lee tells Liv to take Commandant back to base, as his condition could cause issues down the line. Naturally, he refuses, saying that as a fellow soldier fighting to take back the planet, a wound won't impede his willingness to stay on the field. Knowing his mind won't be changed, Lee backs off, and checks the area for lingering jitter bombs before heading off. As night falls, we find a safe building to use as a resting place. Commandant reports his progress to base, then prepares to lay down for the night, when Liv walks over towards him. She talks about how different Grey Raven and Egret are in their team dynamics, and that the reason Vanessa is so hostile towards her in particular is that she sees Liv leaving the team as an act of defiance to her authority. She goes over how she feels about the team, pointing out how every member has the freedom to do as they please. Unknown to them, Lee is eavesdropping on their conversation and has Lucia come with him outside, giving Liv her opportunity to speak her mind in peace. As the sun rises the next day, Lucia and Lee return from their imaginary side mission, and with everyone gathered together, we leave to clear the rest of the corrupted. We go from street to street, steadily making our way to the city center. Lucia and Lee speed ahead, as Liv fires arcs of electricity to hinder the horde. Even Commandant himself is shooting down corrupted. And with the four of us working together, the streets are cleared, leaving the only remaining target the factory itself. However, the closer we get to the factory, the more it ramps up production, and the freshly made machines threaten to spread to other areas. We try to stop them, but there are simply too many. Suddenly, a pillar of white light falls to our left, vaporizing the corrupted, as a second pillar annihilates the factory in front of us. Liv panics, gathering everyone into her force field, having realized that they are within the blast radius, as a third column of light swallows our current position. We try to leave, but 4, then 5. Soon countless beams of light rain down on top of us, preventing anyone from leaving. As the noise dies down, Commandant opens his eyes to find himself in complete darkness. He hears the sounds of Lucia and Lee digging through the rubble, and they pull him out. He is relatively unharmed due to Liv and his exoskeleton, but as he looks around, Liv is nowhere to be seen, despite having been next to him the whole time. We turn to search through the rubble once more, but are stopped as a bullet hits by Commandant's foot. And at the end of the street, a male construct named Teasel, rifle in hand. Vanessa appears behind the construct, along with a smaller female construct named Bambinata. She reveals it was her behind the explosions, and couldn't care less that Liv is missing because of it. In fact, she wouldn't have cared if all of us died in the bombardment. She continues to verbally berate both Commandant and the rest of Grey Raven, even physically abusing her own constructs, slapping Teasel for hesitating to answer her question. She continues to insult their character, pushing harder and harder until Commandant loses to his anger, and in a moment of rage, he pulls out his gun and fires at Vanessa. Back when Liv was part of Egret, a similar situation had occurred. Liv was tasked with sealing off the main roads in and out of the city, as Bambinata disarmed the protective barrier. A few minutes later, Vanessa taps her terminal and a series of missile strikes level the city, greatly reducing the number of corrupted, but also sacrificing a number of Babylonia constructs. She says their job was to lure the corrupted, and that sacrificing a few to save more in the long run makes their deaths worth it. Later in Babylonia, Egret is praised for their efficiency in eliminating the corrupted. Liv did not attend the commendation ceremony, as she does not agree with the tactics used, but knows Babylonia couldn't care less, as their only concern is victory. These thoughts weigh down on her, and to try and distract herself, she goes to the training room, and there she finds Lucia being harassed by another team picking a fight, and she beats them all as Liv watches from around the corner. Somewhere else in Babylonia, a researcher is tasked with picking another member for Grey Raven, and she happens to land on Liv's file. Liv is eventually chosen and transferred to Grey Raven, with Vanessa receiving a generous amount of resources to make up for the loss of a construct. Liv wakes up from her flashback to the sound of Commandant's pistol. She forces her way out of the rubble to find his gun pointed at Vanessa. After he fires, Lee takes aim at the two constructs as Lucia draws her sword, and the opposing egrets do the same. Vanessa wipes the blood from her cheek, and without missing a single beat goes right back to her usual tirade. Commandant continues to stick up for the constructs, fighting against Vanessa's statements when Liv appears. Vanessa tries to switch targets, but before she gets a word off, Liv takes Lucia's sword and cuts off her long hair. She finally gains the courage to stand up to Vanessa, telling her that she is a member of Grey Raven, and that their past together won't hold her back any longer. Now that Liv has joined the fight, it's 4 versus 3, and Vanessa, who prides herself so much on the balance of conflict, knows she won't make it out of a disadvantage like that. She thinks to herself for a moment before turning around and leaving. And after confirming their departure, everyone relaxes a little. The team set off their flares one after another, signaling the end of Grey Raven's first large-scale operation. Liv begins tending to Commandant's wounds and says she will submit a transfer request, as her actions will likely have negative repercussions on Grey Raven. Naturally, we tell her that we won't agree to that, and that she is a Grey Raven, so of course we would stick up for her. The sun breaks through the clouds, and Commandant decides to mark the occasion with a group photo. Liv gives him a recorder from a destroyed recon drone, and as the dust settles, Commandant brings a close to Grey Raven's first big mission. The war is far from over. Many dangerous challenges and difficult battles await Grey Raven, but no matter what, they will always face it together. And that wraps up Echo Aria. Lots of interesting things happening. We have Commandant and his flashback disease, we met some new characters, and got quite a few unanswered questions. With Commandant's flashbacks, I thought they were kind of during the chapter, but they made sense, since it's kind of like his mind struggling to remember any hint of Selena. Oh, and then speaking of Selena, seeing that she became the second source of red tide after being turned into soup by Gabriel is kind of out there, especially since we had no idea Selena would encounter a heterocore fragment. Personally, I like to think that Gabriel sacrificing his arm is what made the difference, since they went into the tide at about the same time. Yeah, then we have the mysterious woman, who we can assume is another Ascendant, or more likely, probably an agent, since she has the power to straight up reconstruct a body and bring someone back from death. Luna is still missing, but I don't think it's her. I feel like they wouldn't go out of their way to make it such a mystery otherwise. We met Hans, who seems to be a lot softer than he lets on. Like, he knows that he has to be strict and by the book because he has a job to do, even if that job hurts him. And then we have Hans' friend Arnold, the old doctor who essentially helped Wanshi find his entire life goal. We met Vanessa, who for sure has to come back later. And who knows, maybe we'll get like a Babylonia Civil War chapter, where teams end up fighting against each other, and she comes after us. Or maybe she like tries to backstab us during a mission later. Last thing would be like Gear in his secret organization. If they have the power to make elite teams just forget about a whole encounter, then they must have some insane power. I would think it's just another Ascendant faction, but Gear would not shut up about Sage, so maybe it's the Sage Machina that was mentioned way back in Chapter 1, and they're finally making their move. Yeah, but anyway, that's all I got. I really didn't think this chapter would end up being so long, but I hope you all enjoyed the video. I can't wait to see you all in the next video, where we will cover Chapter 14 of the main story, Imprisoned Insight.